The rope creaked in the cold, thin way of old wood under weight. Hanged men turned gently in the courtyard, boots swaying above hoarfrost-whitened stone, shadows cutting black against the blue of morning. Breath smoked from every living thing. Even the ravens at the merlins were little smudges of frost and hunger, black eyes bright and pitiless. Jon Snow stood beneath the scaffold with Longclaw at his hip and an ache he could not name working under the breastbone, a pressure that felt like a hand. The hand was colder than the wind. He found himself measuring each slow rotation of Ser Aliser's corpse by the flutter of the man's undone cloak, and he wondered if memory, like a far-off drum, would always beat in time to a dead enemy's slow circling. "Cold day for justice," muttered Ed Tollett by his shoulder, voice dry as old bread, "but warm enough for ghosts." Jon's breath fogged. He said nothing. Justice had seemed clearer when he had been younger and the world had edges. He had been a boy then, slow to anger and quick to forgive, or so he'd like to think. Now the anger came quick as sparks blown from a brazier, and the forgiving was a winter-buried thing. He looked at the faces in the yard, the men who were left of them, 150 tattered brothers where once there had been 700. He had learned each voice by the fire, each cough by the stare, and most of their stories, and still he could not sort who would live and who would die beneath winds none of them had words for. When they cut down the bodies, the thud on planks was muffled by snow. Davos Seaworth watched from the sidelines with that harrowed patience he had, as if every fresh sorrow surprised him by only as much as a man expected to be surprised by night coming on time. The wildlings clustered by the yard's far wall, Tormund shifting his weight, ruddy beard clumped with frost, watching Jon with a big animal's careful humor. A horn sounded once from the ring walk overhead, its voice more flat than urgent. The gate crews were swapping watches, iron on iron clattering, the old beats of a place still pretending to be itself. "They're yours," said Davos quietly. "Say it before your courage fails you." Jon turned. He did not remember deciding to speak. He remembered only the words, as if he'd found them buried in the snow and brushed off their crusted surfaces with half-numb hands. He strode into the open, pulled off his glove, and laid Longclaw flat on the anvil beside the fire as if that were a kind of altar. The wolf pommel peered at the sky, polished eye reflecting light. Ed shifted, frown carving his narrow face, and the men drew closer, the ragged ring of them tightening. "You swore the words at a tree or a stone," Jon called, and his voice rose white and visible. "Or in a hall, or with your hand on the hilt of a sword you meant to trust." "I swore them, too," a murmur under the eaves. He could see Hob leaning out from the kitchens, apron stiff with cold. Clyda's blinking up at the yard from the rookery staircase, a raven on one shoulder like a dockside whore's pet. He saw boys who had never seen a summer, and old men who had forgotten how they lived before black cloth. He saw, nearer to the front, a half-dozen men who had helped to carry the bodies down. Blood dotted their cuffs, dark and slow. "My watch was ended," Jon said. "I died. The rope and the knives and the open door that night were mine to carry, not yours. But this we carry together." He looked at the wall, felt it looking back, felt the cold that was not wind biting deeper than steel could cut. "The watch you swore to and I swore to was meant to guard the realms of men. The realms have changed. Ours is broken. A thing that cannot lift its shield cannot demand your life. Not from boys. Not from old men." Ed's head moved in a small negation, the kind a careful man makes when he knows the world is about to tilt and that he'll have to walk on it regardless. Tormund cocked his head like a hunter hearing a distant horn. "I have no right," Jon said softly then, and that, of everything he said, was the only thing that brought the yard to a true silence. "I have no right under law or custom to unbind your vows. The oaths belong to you and to the living and the dead who heard them. But I will not lead men by a promise I do not believe in. I will not hold you to words that lead you to die in blindness or turn your swords upon your brothers." He rested his palm on the cold steel and felt it draw the heat out of him. It steadied him like a horse's shoulder steadies a rider who has decided to mount or fall. Any man who will stay and fight the darkness in the true north, for love of the living, Not for pride of an order, stay, and I will stand beside you. Any man who will go to his own hearth, to winter with his kin and warn them and stand when the horn sounds thrice, go with my blessing and keep your cloak or cast it off as you please. Any man who would take up arms with me in the wars to come in the south, if we live long enough to fight them, follow me and I will call you brother still. The choice is yours. I release you. The words landed like stones dropped in a winter well. There was no splash. There was, after a long moment, the slight shift of weight 150 men make when they realize they are standing somewhere none of their fathers ever stood. 7 bloody hells, breathed Davos, too low for most to hear. It closed his eyes. The first to step forward was a scarecrow-thin man from the Shadow Tower whose name John could never remember until someone else said it. He tugged at the tie on his black cloak, let it fall, and folded it once before laying it across the anvil as carefully as a man laying down his child. "Mave mother at White Harbor," he muttered. "Widow. Sons'll be drafted or dead by spring without hands to mend nets. I'll go to her." "Go," John said, and meant it. "Tell them. Build walls with wood and words." Another man touched the hilt of Longclaw with 2 fingers and then put them to his lips, an old northern gesture. "I'll not leave," he said. "Name's Kedge of Barrowton. I'm no knight of anything, but I've seen the dead that walk, and I felt their cold through my boots. I'll not have that thing at my sister's bed. I stay." Others came. A lad called Red Jane who had never once beaten him in the yard but never stopped trying, who'd smiled through a broken tooth and bled like a sluice. Clyda's assistant with ink on his hands who could fletch a decent arrow. 3 men who had once raped and might again, men John had never trusted and never would, who nonetheless could hold a spear line steady in the dark. Some went, some stayed. A dozen simply stood where they were with their faces turned to the wall, as if waiting to learn their own minds. Ed did not move. When the murmuring became a ripple, he stepped out into the open, his own cloak still cinched against a chest built narrow by hunger and years. He had the look of a man who had climbed too many ladders with too much weight and found the rungs cracking under him. "You had no right," Ed said quietly. "Not under law or custom, like you said yourself. There's some comfort in a man who names his own treason. But I'll tell you something small and useless." He looked at the men, not at John. "It wasn't our wall to end. It was there before us and will be there after, unless it isn't, and if it isn't, that will be because we were too few and too afraid, not because we cared too much for law. You dead once or twice, makes no matter. Your watch might be ended. Mine isn't. If there's any who'll have no wife and hold no lands and father no children until the night dies of old age, I'll keep them here and I'll keep the horn polished and the gate oiled and I'll write the names when I can remember how to spell them. That's what I can do." John watched the tightness at the corners of Ed's eyes. There was no hatred. The pain in that look was the pain of a carpenter seeing a barn leaning after the men had taken half its beams away to mend their kitchens. "There should have been more of us," Ed said, still in that same quiet tone that made men lean forward. "But there aren't, so I'll sweep. Maybe it's not a calling, M-Lord. Maybe it's just sweeping, but I'll do it. Then you have my sword if you'll have it," John said. "Whether I stand here or there." Ed's mouth twitched. "I'll have it when you bring it back." The choice went out from Castle Black like a raven. It flew on boot leather and rumor and the hum of rope through pulley blocks. Wildlings laughed or glowered or shrugged and asked where the food would come from if there were no more crows to steal from, and then they grinned and asked when the fight would be and against whom. Davos said nothing more until the yard had thinned to a chapped handful on both sides, and the bodies were stacked near the pyre, and the snow began in earnest with flakes like ashes. "Now you'll have to live with it," the Onion Knight said, "and that's always the bastard of it." "I know." John rubbed his hand across Ghost's ruff as the dire wolf eased out of shadow and pressed close. The white fur came away wet with snowmelt where it touched his glove, and beneath the coat there was the warm life of his oldest companion, a heat he could not take for granted when so much else had grown thin and pale. "Ramsay Bolton has Sansa's brother. He has our home. The wall will still be here when we ride back. If we ride back, it will be here if the gods favor splinters," Davos said mildly. "But I imagine the watch will hold." It is what they do, even when it kills them. John looked up at the ice that climbed to the sky. The wall had a face sometimes. Not a face a man would draw, nothing so crude as that. Only a sense. Like the sense a hunter had of something moving the other side of a tree line. The silence of prey being quiet for a reason. He felt, in that moment, a peculiar tug, as if something that lived inside the ice was listening to him. There were old songs that said vows had power. There were older ones still that said vows had roots. "Don't outstare it," Ed murmured. "It always wins." "I have set men free," John said to the cold blue abyss. "Do not punish them for my mercy." The ice said nothing. It held its breath. They rode south within 3 days. Word had run ahead of them. A ragged army of wildlings with a man who'd been Lord Commander at their head. Banners of nothing and no one. Only the sight of the wolf standard someone had dug out of some storeroom. Sansa rode with them under a hooded cloak the color of winter woods, and when she threw back the hood in the shelter of pines, John saw the face of a girl carved into the first scales of a woman, and in her eyes the flint that burns where it finds air. "He'll expect rage," she told John in the tent one black night when the wind worried the canvas like a beast trying to gnaw its way in. "He'll expect you at dawn, charging to meet him because you think the world can be made fair with one good stroke. He knows you now like he knows his hounds. Don't give him that pleasure. We will need more than what you can pull from these men's hearts. What we have is what we have." John shook his head and felt the weight of each decision as if armor plates had been riveted to his bones. Ghost dozed near the brazier with one eye-slitted dream whuffing now and then. The sound cut through the storm like a small oath. "I released the watch. I cannot levy men who have just been unbound." "You can ask them. You can always ask." A small, bitter smile curved Sansa's mouth. "That is the thing no one tells us when we're children, that asking is a blade. Cuts without blood. It leaves scars you don't see until they ache in the weather." He looked at her hands, neat on her knees, pale, scarred in places. She had learned too many lessons from too many sharp teachers. The rage that rose in him at that thought felt cleaner than most of the anger he carried, and he set it aside with care. He would need it later like dry wood kept from the snow. Davos said they would need banners and bread and the sort of speeches that made stubborn men set their jaws and old ladies cry in the back of the crowd and give up their winter stores. Tormund said they would need meat and a very big fire. John thought they would need luck or grace or some older word that lived under both of those, something that felt like the old gods if you stood under a heart tree long enough. They went first to Bear Island because the old blood there still remembered what it meant to send daughters to war and to ask no man's leave when the sea blew hard. The wind off the sound blew like knives, and snow shone steel-bright on the shoulders of pines. Lyanna Mormont sat straight and small in her carven chair with her teeth clenched so hard they might have been part of the wood. She heard them out with the air of a girl measuring a story against what she had already learned to be true. "I have 62 fighting men," she said at last with that cold calm of hers. "I don't have wives to spare, and we don't trade daughters where I can help it, and I don't hunt for glory. But a dead thing can't be killed by common courage, and I hear you've seen them. I hear you released your watch." She tilted her chin. "Some say it was coward's work. Some say it was clever's work. I say it was a man's work. Men answer for their choices." "I do," John said. "So do I." Little Bear's eyes flicked to Sansa. "We'll ride with the wolf if the wolf will keep his teeth in the right direction. But hear me, Snow. If I find a single dead hand on the shore of my island, I'll send your head to Winterfell in a lobster pot." 62. It was 62 more than they had. They took them and rode on. In the Deepwood and at Torrens Square and in halls where the fires burned low, they begged and argued and swore. Some men hung back and asked them to come again when the Boltons had fallen and the odds were better and honor less costly. Some sent sons they could spare and none they loved. Some sent bread. The Umbers sent nothing, and the Karstarks snarled from behind iron-latticed gates where the banners had been repainted with shelves of blank space where wolves had once run. They built an army in pieces. There was no sun to bless it, only a dull winter disk that rolled behind clouds as if tired of its old path. Jon looked at the men who had been brothers of the Watch, and at the men who had been enemies at the edge of the world, and at the farmers who had cut long scythes off shorter shafts to make spears, and he thought, I have no right to them either, but they are here. In those nights he dreamt sometimes that he had walked to the wall alone and laid his hand upon it and felt, like a low hum through bone, the echo of other hands. It had not felt like a face, then, but like something older, the way a tree feels old when you lean your back against it in summer and close your eyes and hear bees. He woke from that dream with his heart drumming and a taste of iron on his tongue. Sometimes he woke to other dreams, a hallway of doors and a woman's voice calling him Sweetling in a tongue he did not speak while blue winter seeped under the doors. When the bastard of Bolton called him out, he did it with words like claws. The letter arrived on a blotted scrap. The letters had a look as if they'd been hacked into the page with a dull knife. Send me my bride. Send me my bride's brother. Send me your banners, Wolf. You'll know I have Rickon by the way the hounds lick their teeth when you say his name. Jon had not known that he had held hope until the hope was pulled through him like an arrow. He carried the letter out to the snow and burned it with a steady hand that made Davos glance sideways and Sansa look at him full. He did not throw the ashes into the wind. He pressed them into the white with his thumb, a small black stain that the storm licked away. The field they chose lay on ground that had been trampled by flocks for generations. The grasses lay flat and brittle under a shaving of white, and the wind came across from Winterfell in puffs that brought the smell of wood smoke and the faint, sweet rot of old deer droppings. Ramsay Bolton rode with banners that fluttered bright as blood against the pale. His men were better clothed and better fed and better mounted. His infantry was disciplined. The cold did not care whose boots it chewed. Jon stood before his line and watched the bastards' men form ranks and move as if one mind wore 1,000 helms. The wildlings shifted and murmured. The X-Watch kept their spears grounded and their faces tight. Ghost loped along the rear, a pale ghost indeed, watching with eyes that showed no fear and no understanding of human banners. Don't charge, Davos said softly at Jon's side. Make him come to us. Let him break against us. He wins if your blood runs hotter than your sense. He knows it too. Jon nodded. He thought of Ed at the wall with whatever remnant he had coaxed to stay. He thought of the men he had released and the ones he had let go into the world like sparks blown from a fire that would never grow to flame. He thought of a wall with a face that watched and waited. He thought of a boy running. Rickon, all legs and laughter once, shouting at gray wind to race him. He thought of the sound of an arrow. Ramsay sent the boy at them, and Jon's heart tore like fabric. He did not hear Davos curse. He did not hear the wild roar behind him. He only saw Rickon run. The arrows fell around the boy in a rhythm that felt like a cruel song, and Jon's horse surged under him without conscious command. He rode into the hail and felt the arrows hiss past. He leaned into the bow of the saddle and reached with his whole body. He was still reaching when the arrow came true and Rickon folded like a bird shot mid-flight, and the wolf he had once been cracked down the middle as clean as a winter branch. The battle of the bastards fell on them like a storm. Men went down and got up and went down again. Snow turned red under boots, the color of old wine. Clots of meat and trodden banners and broken pikes. Jon lost his horse and the press closed, bodies forced against his chest, his face, his ribs. The weight and steam of men were a sea, and he was breathing salt water and remembering a hand on his shoulder. He fought because there was no place to stop. Longclaw bit and slid and bit again. The X-Watch held where the wildlings would have flowed, and the wildlings poured where the X-Watch would have stubborned. And somewhere in that space between flowing and stubbornness, Jon found the thin seam that held them together. He looked once up at a sky that had narrowed to a strip between helms and pikes and saw, above all of it, a wedge of riders crest a hill, banners of the falcon whipping in a wind that smelled of Ares and treachery. Sansa's face burned in his mind like the ember left from a log's long fire. The little smile she'd given him when she said she had sent a letter to a man she hated for help they might need if he didn't hate her more. They won. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like not dying, which is different only to men who have never been close to both. One died with arrows like a hedge sprouting from him and a sigh like a mountain shifting, and they laid Rickon in Winterfell's cold earth with words that did not touch the depth of what had been taken or given back. Sansa went to see her husband in the Hound Kennel and came back with snow clotted in her cloak and a small, tight piece on her mouth. Jon did not ask. The dead do not require reproach. The living do not always deserve it. In the great hall of Winterfell, they gathered the northern lords. Smoke clung to the rafters as if the room had recently been a burnt tree still standing. Lyanna Mormont sat with her hands folded and looked at men who had blustered and boasted and been absent when wolves needed teeth. Wyman Manderly stroked his beard and said wise things in a voice that smiled at its own wisdom. And Lord Glover apologized to nobody and said he had a hearth to protect. You have a hearth because men with no hearth held the wall for 1,000 years, Lyanna said with the flat bluntness of an axe. You had a hearth because men like my mother bled in this wind. We can do our judging after the snow melts. It's not melted. They shouted then and pledged then, and when they banged their cups and cried for the king in the north, Jon felt the crown like a frostburn on his brow. He had not asked for it. He had not refused it. Perhaps that was the same thing. He thought of Ed at the wall and of an ice voice listening with the patience of caves. When they parted and left him in the cold quiet that follows noise, he stood in the godswood and placed his palm to the heart tree's bark and hoped that the feel of life under the skin of Ancient Wood could be enough. Snow fell like ash for 3 days without wind. In that stillness, ravens came. 3 ravens, 3 days. The first brought a brief, spare hand from Ed. We live. There are fewer. The trees creak. 1 horn in the night. Nothing seen. Sometimes you have to write the quiet down so you can believe it happened. The second was shorter. 2 horns. Rangers saw dead men on the far side of Eastwatch's rocks. Tide froze on the hem. They watched us with the stillness of knives on a shelf. We are not enough. The third was a feather, taped to a strip of vellum with a smear of something that might have been pine pitch or might have been blood. The vellum said, "The wall is humming." Jon took the letters into the great hall where the blue of the light made the rushes look gray. Sansa read the words with a frown that cut her forehead like a small blade pressed down. Davos paced. Tormund chewed a knuckle thoughtfully. "What does that mean?" said Davos. "What does a wall hum when it's not a carpenter's wall and not a whore's back room?" "It means the spells within it are stirring," said a voice at the door, mild, curious, and out of breath with excitement. Samwell Tarly waddled in with cheeks pink from cold and pride in his eyes, as if he had simply done something he had set out to do and could not imagine why anyone would be astonished. Gilly came behind with the child in her arms, and both of them looked as if the winter had bitten them and they had bitten back. "Hello, Jon." Jon crossed the floor in 3 strides and took Sam in his arms, and in that brief, fierce minute he was a boy again who had found another boy in a world that would grind them both down if it could. He stepped back and looked at Sam's face. "I went to Old Town like I said I would," Sam poured out, hands already groping in his satchel. "And I read, and the maesters told me there were no such things as the dead that walk because their lessons taught them not to hear a song unless it had been sung in a certain key. And Jon, listen to me. There are words in the oldest books that don't look like words until you put them next to other words, and when you do you realize what they are. The wall is a gate and also a lock, and it was forged not only of ice and stones and the will of men but of promise, of vows. Not just the vows one man makes to another, but the vow 1,000 hands make touching a thing for 1,000 winters." Jon could not help but laugh then, the laugh that comes with fear because the body thinks it has tricked itself into living a few minutes longer. "I just broke those vows, Sam." "Yes," Sam said, a little miserably and half defiant. "You also kept them. That's the trick of things with 2 edges. You were right to do it and wrong in the way you were right. Oh gods, I sound like one of them now. Listen, I think the wall is bound to the watch by more than the old songs. I think the strength of it is braided into the strength of the vows, and when you unbraid one you loosen the other. It won't fall. It's too old and stubborn to fall because a man said words in a cold yard, but it may not hold the way we thought it would. The others don't batter. They seep. If they find a seam, they'll work it like water in a rock." "How long?" Sansa asked. Her voice was clean and clipped. "How long before seep becomes storm?" "I don't know." Sam pushed his hair out of his eyes in a gesture John knew too well from boyhood. There are ways, well, not ways, thoughts. The children bound the first spells with weirwood sight and men's vows. If the magic is unbraiding, you can braid it again. It needs words and blood and will. And fire, perhaps. Fire always helps. Dragonglass will help. We have dragonglass, Davos said. On Dragonstone. They looked at him. He spread his hands. The Red Woman told Stannis, and Stannis told me. And not for the first time, a king's old foolishness wants to be a living man's wisdom. If we went there and pried it up like oysters, would we bleed less for it here? Dragonstone belongs to Daenerys Targaryen, Sansa said. Or will soon. Word is she's crossed back with ships and unsullied and brown men with bright eyes and longer spears than sense. Jon felt the old name like a throb of heat in a place that had grown used to cold. He remembered Melisandre's talk of kings and flames and the smell of incense that hid, thinly, the smell of old madness. He thought of dragons as boys think of them. Shadow on sky and a heat so complete it becomes silence. She is not our enemy, he said at last. Not if what Sam says is true. If we cannot hold the wall by spells and vows alone, we will hold it with fire. And we will braid vows again, but we will braid them different. What does that mean? Sansa's eyes were steady on his. It means I was wrong and right, Jon said. He looked at Ghost, who raised his head without complaint, as he always had. I freed men from an oath that made them blind. I will not bind them again to the same blindness. But there is a vow that needs making, and not only by men who think they are done with the world. When the horn sounds thrice, anyone who hears it should come. Not days later, not with excuses, not behind walls they think will hold because other men's fathers built them. The vow will not be to a place or a cloak. It will be to the living. It will say, I will stand when winter walks. I will leave my harvest in the field and my wedding bed unmade, and I will come. I will have no wife that day, no land that day, no sons that day. For one day, for as many days as the long night lasts, I will be no man of house or holdfast. I will be the shield. Sansa's mouth softened. Sam's breath sped up as if he'd run up a tower. Davos scratched his beard. It won't bind like a lifetime vow, Sam warned. Old magic likes things that last and cost dearly. It will cost. Jon felt the truth of it like a blade laid to his palm. It will cost because men will hate it. They will think it an insult to their pride that a horn can unsire them for a day. We will see who hates pride more than death. There are enough men like Ed who will keep the old oath. There must be, or it all unwinds. But the new vow will catch the rest of it. And we will ask a dragon queen for stone that burns. Ask nicely, Davos said, and take bread. They sailed east in a narrow-beamed ship that bucked like a colt in the Bay of Seal's winter chop. Jon had not been to sea since boyhood, and that had been a quick, ill journey to White Harbor over in a day. This voyage stretched, the sky and the water exchanging places when waves rose like hills and crashed down as if the world were trying to turn itself inside out. Davos walked the deck as if he had been born in a storm, his feet finding the ship's mind under his. Sam leaned over the side a great deal and came back green and apologetic. Sansa refused to vomit out of sheer stubbornness and lay in her bunk with a look of focused hatred vigorous enough to melt ice. Ghost did not like the ship. He prowled the deck with a low, steady rumble and slept uneasily with one paw wedged against the mainmast as if planning to jump to shore and carry the ship with him by force of will if he had to. Dragonstone rose from fog like the bones of a beast whose flesh had been cooked away by its own breath. The black of it was not like common stone. It drank light instead of reflecting it, and the angles seemed to bend to eyes that tried to follow them, like reading the shape of a crow's wing mid-flight. Jon stood on the landing and felt, unmistakably, a warmth roll down from the heights like breath. They climbed to the great hall, and the woman on the black chair watched them come with a composure that made Jon's shoulders tighten by instinct in respect. She was small and spare and wore her hair like a crown of pale iron. The dragons slumbered somewhere out of sight. There sent a faint brine and ash mixture in the galleries that made his mouth water like a dog's at the smell of meat. "Welcome to Dragonstone," said Missandei in a softer accent than the city down the hill had. "Queen Daenerys Stormborn of the House Targaryen, the first of her name." "She knows her name," said a short man with pale hair and dark eyes and an ironic mouth. "If the winter hurts as much as I hear it does in the north, we can save our breath for the negotiating." Daenerys's gaze held Jon's without challenge or invitation. "You are the one who died and did not stay dead," she said, "and then told men they didn't have to do what they had sworn. That was brave or foolish. Those two often look alike after the fact." "Both," Jon said. She smiled a little at that, and something loosened around his ribs. Tyrion Lannister's eyes flicked with interest. Davos inclined his head to both of them with a politeness that did not smell of bending. "We came to ask for stone that was here before any king in your line," Jon said, "and for fire that was hatched across a sea before your father built what he broke. We came because the dead are marching, and because a wall of ice that we thought would hold by itself may not hold by itself." He did not tell her everything. He did not tell her that he had broken a braid of magic old as the tongues of rivers. He did not need to. She had the look of a woman who understood that every bargain has an absence in it as real as its terms. "Show me," she said simply. "Show me what is marching. Show me a dead thing that will not bend. Show me bones that move without breath." They brought her and her counselors north in a fast ship with Dothraki, who had never seen snow, holding their coats close and shivering when the light went thin and the sea turned from iron to steel. The dragons came above them, shadowing waves with wings that seemed to beat slower than any birds and yet moved them faster, as if they knew the mind of air and could tell it to be something else. Jon watched her ride the Black One, the one men called Drogon, and felt the old child's awe that had a man's caution braided into it. Sam watched with his mouth open, and Gilly tried not to smile too widely and failed, and Sansa stood with her hands behind her back and showed a face that would never betray the thousand thoughts inside it, and the Dothraki made wordless sounds that had the shape of prayers. At the foot of the wall they met Ed, gaunter than he had been and with a new cut on his cheek that looked like a tear had been frozen to his face and then torn away. He bowed to Daenerys as if he were bending to tie a boot and then rising again from a task with no grandeur. "You bring fire," he said to Jon. "I bring help," Jon said, "and I bring cones of words and notions to pry at old doors." "Fine," Ed said. "I bring a kettle and a broom. Between us we'll make a world." He took them up onto the walkway and let them press their hands to the ice. Daenerys did. The Dragon Queen in her fur-lined cloak placed her palm upon the wall with a seriousness that surprised him. And a long moment later she drew in her breath and looked at Jon with eyes darkened as if the pupil had swallowed the iris. "It hums," she said simply. "Like a hive," Ed said. "Like a sleeping cat. Like a thing that might purr if it wasn't so big." They showed her a dead man they had taken on the far side, bound in chains and kept apart like a snake in a barrel. When they opened the cask, it thrashed and froze and thrashed. Davos took her hand before she could step forward. She did not pull away. Jon saw her gaze move, precise, cold, to the thing's wrists where flesh had cracked like old leather around frost-white bone. She nodded. The dragon spoke behind her, a low rumble in throats that were fire's first echo. "Take your stone," she said that night under stars so sharp they seemed like nails hammered into sky. "Take the glass and burn these things. Take my fire when I bring it, if I bring it, when I decide that my fire should be given to men who used it so poorly the last time they had a dragon to hand. We will pay for what we take," Jon said, "with iron and furs and salt fish and what else men can take from a frozen world. And with a vow." She tilted her head, curious. He told her then, and Ed and Sam, and the handful of men who had come with from Winterfell. He told them of the braid of old promises and the feeling he had at the wall and the instinct he had followed with a young man's fierce simplicity that he now needed to complicate with a leader's care. He told them of a new vow that would be no man's collar and every man's summons. "You will write words and expect men to obey them," Tyrion said mildly. "Bold." "It is all we have," Jon said. "Words. Words spoken with witness. Words said with life behind them. That is how magic lives in the world, by being believed with the whole body. And by blood, Sam whispered. The old books are clear because they do not have to be kind. Something must be given that cannot be grown again. They went to the little weirwood that clung to the lee of the wall where the wind sometimes forgot itself and the branches stuttered in their slow red. There had once been a grove here, Ed said. Men had cut it for firewood in a winter where they had enemy enough and more enemy than wood. One tree remained, its face carved half-heartedly by some brother long dead who had not believed in the thing he was making. John laid his palm on the trunk and felt the life under the bark, slow as glaciers and stubborn as old men. He spoke his vow quietly, because power carried better that way. He said, "When the horn sounds thrice, the hearth is a lie and the name is a coat you must take off and hang on a peg. You are no father and no son that day, no husband and no lord. You are the shield that stands and the fire that stays lit and the eyes that do not close. For that day you will not lie with your wife or count your coin or tend your cattle. For that day you are no one and you are everyone. And when the horn goes silent, you may take up your name again if you have it still. If you do not, we will say your name for you." Others said it after him. Ed's voice was thin, Davos's rougher, Sansa's clear as water through ice. Sam said it with tears running down his face, as if he had found in it something he had been waiting to hear all his life. Daenerys did not speak it. She stood with her hands at her sides and listened with the courtesy due to something old and possibly dangerous. Then she said very simply, "What will you give it so that it knows you are serious?" John looked down at his hands. Ghost pushed his muzzle into his palm, warm and wet. He looked at his own blood more often now than he had when he was younger. It came more readily. A scrape against a frozen latch, a slice from a careless knife. Blood was always eager to be part of things, he thought. It ran at any invitation. He drew Longclaw across his palm. The cut was clean and welled slowly. He pressed it to the heart tree's face. He felt, for a moment, the oddest sense of being recognized. As if the wood had smelled something in him it remembered from a long way off. Others bled as well. Davos, scowling, did it with the practical resignation of a sailor who knows what a rope will do to his hands but grips it anyway. Ed muttered something grim about splinters in the afterlife. Sansa made no sound. Sam swore softly because he always swore softly. Daenerys watched. She did not cut herself. She stepped instead to the tree and laid her palm upon the sticky bark and stood there with her eyes closed. John watched her face. It did not soften. It did not harden. It remained most itself, which impressed him more than he could say. "The old magic does not know me," she said after a long while. "My blood is not its blood. It does not refuse me, simply does not hear me. Men made this. Men must mend it. It will hear your fire," Sam said almost apologetically. "It will," she acknowledged. They took stone out of the mountain. Men swung picks until the handles cracked, and dust caked their faces until every man was the same color, soot and sweat and chalk. Dragonglass came up like black teeth and lay in heaps under tarps that turned blue when frost took them at night. The smiths worked it with sighs and curses and the careful patience of men who know they are teaching their hands a new trade when they would rather be remembering an old one. Arrows, spearheads, daggers as brittle as a girl's heart when she hears she has been promised to a man too old to draw his own bath. You had to work with its limits, but it bit like truth. The first time they fought with dragons at their back, it felt like cheating. John thought he would feel triumph. He felt only relief as sudden as a fall through ice into moving water. The dead came in numbers that made numbers only an old habit men had learned to comfort themselves. They flowed like weather. They reached, they climbed, they did not tire, they did not scream when they burned, and when parts of them fell, the parts crawled. Daenerys's dragons turned swathes of them to steam. The white of the snow reached out to grab what was left and smooth it over, and then more came. Ed held the gate with 24 men, and none of the men who stood there would have stood if John had not said what he had said in a yard some months ago, and that knowledge twisted in him until it nearly made him laugh. The wrong and the right were never content to live apart. They always took the same address when winter came, in a lull that lasted as long as it takes a poor cook to peel an onion. John stood with his breath smoking and Longclaw hissing as its edge cooled and watched the blue beyond the blue. The air had a taste of old copper. He remembered facing a single White Walker once on a ridge above a wildling village when the sky was a hard white that hid nothing. And now there were more shapes deeper in the storm that had the same strange stillness. They were not men. They were not anything he had words for. Daenerys swooped past on Drogon, and the heat was a slap on his face that felt like a kiss from a fevered lover. She glanced down and tossed her head. A wild, small movement, and then they were on, and the flame rolled out, and the line where winter ended and fire began was a sermon in a language every creature understood. Men cheered, jaws open in child's joy. Ed did not cheer. He leaned his shoulder against the gate as if it were an old friend's arm and allowed himself a smile as small as a sparrow. That nig. HT, under the lee of the wall where the wind was less cruel and a fire could live longer than a breath. They sat and ate something that had potato in it by the grace of a quartermaster's cunning or an old woman's affection somewhere south. Daenerys ate with the neatness of someone trained to do it in a court and the hunger of someone who had been in a desert and never forgot. She watched the men. She watched Jon. A dozen thoughts moved under her composed face like fish under ice. "You speak with words and blood," she said softly to Jon, away from the rest, near a patch of ice that had been shaved away to water to fill pots. The water was black. It saw them and said nothing. "You might be a better priest than any I have known." "I have known some poor ones," Jon said. "If I were a priest, I would forgive less and remember more." He smiled at himself. "No, that's not true. I would forgive more and remember the same. That is my trouble when the accounting is due." "Forgiveness is a word people use when they want to be allowed to live with themselves," she said with the same soft clarity. "It isn't a bad word. Neither is pride. But when the night is long, they both get in the way. Better to have duty. Duty is a lamp on a nail. It lights the thing it points at and leaves the rest dark. That's all any of us can bear." He wondered then what had carved duty into her like a river carves a canyon. He wondered what she thought of him, truly, when she was done thinking about what she needed from him. He wondered how many men had wondered the same and been wrong. They fought again. They lost ground and took it back. Ghost came back bleeding once with black blood on his muzzle. And Sansa cleaned him with a tenderness that surprised no one who had ever seen a Stark with a dog. Sam climbed a tower and shouted down passages of lore to men who could not hear him, and then climbed down and fetched water like any squire and wept where no one would see him and laughed where everyone would. Davos put men in the places a trader puts cargo so a ship will not roll more than it already does. Ed remained where a man should remain when he has decided that remaining is his only honest work. One morning the air changed. It had weight in it like the weight a room has when someone enters who is not impressed by the furniture. Jon felt it in his teeth and in the scar where the knives had gone in and in the way Longclaw hung slightly different on his hip, as if the sword knew something about balance before its owner did. They came on with the weather itself folded around them. The world narrowed to a whiteness that had shape the way a ghost has shape when you are very cold and very tired. In that whiteness moved a darkness that was not made of lack but of presence. A line of them, tall and cold, with eyes that did not so much shine as make other things show they were not shining. Jon felt his heart do that old deer's leap it had done when he was a boy and thought he had heard his father's step in the corridor and realized after a moment that it had been only his own. He stepped forward into the clear space their advance created, a courtesy of horror. The Night King came with them. Jon did not know what else to call him. He wore no crown. He did not need one. His stillness was a crown. He stood where the storm opened and lifted his hand, and men around Jon stopped moving because their muscles had forgotten what to do next. Time stretched. If someone had whispered a prayer then, some old northern one with 3 words and a sigh, it might have been enough to start breath again. As it was, a dragon screamed, "Daenerys dove?" Drogon's fire kissed the snow and made it leap to steam with a noise like grain poured in a flood into a barrel. The Night King did not move. He looked up. He lifted his arm quick as a blink and a spear of clear blue came into being. And Jon's belly went cold with a fear that was not his own, as if the old magic had crawled into him for a moment and remembered a wound. But the spear flew not at Drogon but at the wall itself. It struck and the hum changed. Jon felt it go through his bones. He heard men cry out. He might have been one of them. The place where the spear hit darkened as if a bruise were blooming under the skin of the world. Cracks ran from the bruise like dry riverbeds forming between hills. The sound was a low moan that did not stop. "Now," Ed said conversationally from beside Jon, voice steady not because he was brave but because he had been scared so long that he had used it all up, "would be a good time for your vow." The horn sounded thrice. Ed blew it himself. He put his mouth to the thing and poured his life through it as if he were the bagpipe and the horn was his lungs. It sang. It sang into the whiteness. It sang into the living and the dead and the space between. The first to come were men with black cloaks and men with no cloaks and boys with no mustaches and old men with beards so iced they were armor. They came out of halls into courtyards and out of courtyards into streets and out of streets onto the high road because the horn does that to a man who has chosen beforehand what he will be when it sounds. Others came later. Men who had to kiss wives and turn away, who had to pull boots on with hands that wanted to take other things down from shelves, with guilt hot in them like tea. They came. In Winterfell's yard the word was spoken again. Sansa said it. She said it into the ears of men who had sons and of women who could pull a bow as well as any man. She said it in a tone that did not ask, did not order, but made a space into which a person must step or know themselves forever. Some men did not come. Some never heard it because snow muffled sound and fear muffled words. Some heard and choose to put logs on their fires and wish the dark luck. There will always be that. Old magic has never once demanded a world without cowards. It knows its own business too well for that. Jon stood under the wall with the storm pressing down and felt, unmistakably, the braid begin to take. Words had been said. Blood had been given. Will had been laid before something older than kings. He saw it the way a man sees wind as a ripple on grass. The cracks he had watched spidering across the ice hesitated, held, drew back like a breath reconsidered. The bruise lightened the way a hurt lightens when a hand that knows how to press finds just the right place. "Hold," he said. He did not know he was saying it until afterwards. It was not an order. It was a request to the world. Hold. Hold. The fighting that day was like holding a door against a flood when the hinges have been oiled by someone who loved you and knew this day would come. Men died. That sentence needs no trimming or decoration. They died in 2s and 3s and by the heap.
Dragon glaçant.
Flame roared. Ed did not fall that day because there were older jokes yet in him and they wanted to be told. Daenerys burned and burned until the dragons were weary and the wind stank of tangy steam and old bones. The Night King watched. At last he withdrew, not like a man beaten but like a bank closing for the night at its customary hour. The wall held. The hum went back to its old pitch. The bruise remained like a memory. Through the rest of that winter, the part that followed, which felt like a second winter grafted onto the first, they fought and mended and fought again. The vow rang out from towers and steeples, from the tops of granaries and from the middle of fields where someone had climbed a herrick to make the sound carry, and made it because the wind liked to take things and carry them as if it had been told by old gods to do it or by none at all. The braid grew tighter. The dead found fewer seams. The living found ways to be brave that they had thought belonged only to stories. Sam found proof in the Citadel's musty throat that Rhaegar had married Lyanna Stark, and that proof came into Winterfell like a coal held in tongs, bright enough to burn the hand that held it and anything it touched. He told Sansa first because wisdom is knowing whose face should receive what news before another, and then he told Jon, and then they told Daenerys because there are very few times a secret grows safer with retelling, and this was not one of them. Jon listened to his name reshaping itself in the old hall and felt very tired and very young. "Names are coats," he said into the silence afterward. "Some fit better. This one is too fine for me. It will trip me and make me spill my supper." "You will grow into it," Sansa said. "I am not sure I want to," he said. "Want is for summers," said Davos. "Winter asks what you did." Daenerys looked at him with that old, precise curiosity and then away. Whatever had lived between them, spoken or not, had something placed over it then like cloth over a mirror where a dead man is laid out. They did not pull the cloth away. They left it. There was other work. Cersei Lannister sent word south that she would come to parley, and then sent men who were good at lying to stand there and smirk while their queen had other work done. The parley broke like thin ice under a foot that weighs more than it knows. Men shouted and spoke distances and thought they were drawing lines. Winter did not care. The end came in a fog that was not fog, a weather that ate sound and made the world small. A dozen of them went out from the wall because old stories say that heroes go and find their enemies instead of waiting for them. Daenerys brought dragons because sometimes old stories are useful in other ways. Jon went because he had long since forgotten how to tell himself to stay behind and care for the accounts when men he loved went to fight. They crossed a lake where the ice sang under them like a woman with a broken heart trying to hide it and failing. The dead rose from the water because of course they did. They were surrounded because of course they were. The ring shrank, and men like Gendry, whom Jon had not known he would know until he knew him, which is how life is, ran back with messages in their legs, and dragons came because the air had been carved by a name that married duty and desire in a way the world sometimes respects. The Night King threw his spear. It caught Viserion in the chest and turned him into a dead bell before he hit the ice. The sound was a vast thing. There are men who still hear it in their dreams even now. The lake swallowed fire and then gave it back as steam and then froze again. Jon saw Daenerys scream without a sound as if her throat had been taken from her and flew to her, and everything after that was confusion and cold. He went under and water became air, and air became water, and hands became ice and ice became hands. When he broke the surface he coughed and saw sky through steam. He saw the Night King watching him across the shrinking space. He saw, for the second time in his life, the silence of death take a living thing he loved beyond the reach of any voice. Later he would ask himself whether he had broken a wall and a dragon had answered his breaking with its own. Later he would answer himself that the world tangled lines and made of them a knot, and that knot had been pulled tight years before he was born. They retreated. The dead opened their arms and the lake gave them a dragon. And the dragon got up and wore cold fire in its mouth and flew with a sound like the end of a song played backwards. The wall held a little while longer because it had been made to hold and because vows had been said and heard. But the bruise returned with a spear of cold flame, and ice remembers where it has been hurt. Fell at Eastwatch, not the whole of it, but enough. It fell not like a tower kicked over, but like a tooth pulled from a jaw that has more teeth. It went with a groan that had lived in it since the day it was born. Men wept as if a god had died. Perhaps one had. Old things lose their lives too. Ed watched it fall. He did not throw himself into the breach with the noble stupidity men like to share around the fire when the cold keeps them awake. He counted his men and took them back to where the line could be held. He blew the horn thrice until his lips bled, and then he gave the horn to a boy because the boy's lips were newer and bled less and his air was better. He did not write a letter. He swept. The dead came through. The vow held enough men where they needed to be held that the living did not break like a dry twig. They bent like green ones and whipped back. Cities in the north took on a new look, a look no one had seen since the first tales were told by men with animal skins tied around their waists and women who had delivered babies in snowdrifts because the child would not wait. Winterfell became a fortress. It had always been one. Now it learned new arts. The gods would stank of dragonglass and leather and coal smoke and old iron. Daenerys settled her dragons in the outer bailey and paced like a woman who had had something cut out of her and was learning how to stand in the new balance. Jon walked the battlements with Ghost and did what his father had taught him. Look, listen, ask, worry, decide. Sleep when you can, eat when you are told, love when it is permitted, and bind every small victory with a knot he tied with his own hand. Bran sat in a chair and looked at the world as if the world were a map and his eyes a pair of pins. Arya came home like a knife that had finally found the sheath it was made for. She looked at Sansa and found a mirror. She looked at Jon and found a brother. She looked at Daenerys and found a queen and a rival and a friend and a shape in the air she would never have words for. They learned one another, which is all a family is when you strip banners away. The last battle was not called the last battle by anyone until afterward because men who live in stories with last battles are in the habit of telling them that way. Men who live and die in the real winter simply go where they have to be and hope to climb out of their armor in time to piss before they sleep. It happened where roads meet northeast of Winterfell, in a place where the land dips like a spoon. There was a barrow there with old bones that had not stirred in 1,000 years. The dead stirred them with a laugh like a whispered word. They came up spoiling for the sun. The living met them. The vow sent men and women from farther south than any of them had expected. Even Sam. There were Riverlanders who had walked in from the gray. There were mountain clansmen who laughed as they ran and then had their laughter frozen on their teeth. There were Ironborn who had learned a new prayer. There were men from the Reach who had sworn to air and bread instead of roses and felt themselves lighter for it. Sansa stood in mail with a cloak over it that had once been her mother's and looked over maps not because maps win battles but because they help you hate yourself less when you lose. Arya stood where shadows went to sharpen themselves. Daenerys flew. Drogon burned. Rhaegal burned. Jon fought in the press on the ground because that was where he belonged when the counting was done. Ghost vanished into the fog and reappeared red and white and red again. Davos kept men in the weave he liked. Ed told jokes and did not stop to see if anyone heard them. Sam killed a White Walker and threw up and killed another and then did not throw up because his body had learned how not to do that thing. The Night King came on foot. Sometimes a king must. He moved through the press as if the press did not believe in him. Men stumbled back without understanding why their feet had betrayed them. The spear he carried was the idea of cold made sharp. He looked at Jon as if remembering something he had never known. Jon felt something settle inside him, an old simple recognition that enemies sometimes give men the gift of purpose. They fought like weather. Jon's arm went numb to the shoulder where the spear had brushed him. Longclaw rang as if striking bells. The air between them hissed as if scalded. The Night King moved with a grave dancer's economy. He did not waste steps. Jon did not either. It was all sore breath and the knowledge of one more cut and the understanding that none of this would matter to the world and all of it mattered to the living, which is the only world that means anything on the day you are fighting for it. In the end, Arya leapt from a shadow where no one was knowing there was shadow. And the hand that caught her wrist was not Jon's hand, but the hand that had known men when men were meat. She dropped the dagger and caught it with the other hand and drove it home into a seam in the ice that was not ice. And Jon saw a look pass over the Night King's face like the absence of a thought. The king fell, and the dead fell with him, and the sound they made was not a sound as snow is not sound. But afterward men would say they had heard something, and it would be the sound that an old story makes when it lies down. Silence came. It did not stay, as silence never does. But it came and it put its hand on every head and said, "Hush." Jon stood with Longclaw point down in snow that had recently been men and now was water, and he breathed. Ghost pressed his flank to Jon's thigh and leaned in with all his weight because a body steadied another whether man or beast. Daenerys slid off Drogon with blood at her nose and smoke in her hair and walked to Jon with a gait that said, "We are not finished, even when we are." They burned the dead and burned them again. People who had not been kissed were kissed out of sheer gratitude that mouth still worked. People who had loved were loved, hard and honest as people do when they are not sure whether they are still borrowed from the gods or whether the gods were theirs to begin with. Sansa sat and wrote names. Arya slept with her feet in a man's lap and her head in a woman's lap and snored like a small storm. Davos counted bread and felt wealthy. Dead did not wake. He had lain down against the cold at last like a man finishing a chore, and he had slipped away. They found him with a half-smile on that long, mournful face and buried him under stones because men like Ed prefer stones to speeches. The vow remained. Men took it for years afterward, not only in times of fear. It became a thing like harvest and plowing, like setting traps for winter hares. When the horn sounded thrice in later winters, and it always does in some winter or other, men came. It had become an ordinary magic, which is the only kind that lasts. Jon refused a crown twice and accepted it once for a while. He did not keep it long because crowns are bad hats for men who like open air. He gave Winterfell to Sansa, who kept it for everyone and made of it again what it had always been. A house that thinks first of hearth and then of hall. Arya went where maps have only the word "here be dragons" and laughed when she found none. Bran ruled in his way, which means he watched and understood and refused to turn men into pieces on a board when he could help it. Sam became a maester and also something else. A keeper of vows who knew that when men say words carefully and bleed carefully and want carefully, the world changes its weight. Daenerys left when it was time to leave. She went south and east and west, and she learned from each place and made of each place a lesson. She and Jon spoke seldom because there are some chords that must be struck only once or they become a tune you cannot stop humming. They did not marry. They did not have children. They had the knowledge of a fight shared and a magic braided and a winter turned. That was much. That was enough. On some mornings in late springs, men walking the ring walk on tea. He wall say they can feel a hum in the ice. It is not the old hum. It is a quieter one, like a hive in a sunny ditch. They lay their hands to the ice and feel it listen. On those days, a man might hear, if he puts his ear to the cold and the wind is not talking, a voice that says something like, I keep what is given to me. Bring me your words and your care, and I will make of them a wall. But if you bring me only your fear, I will be a mirror, and you will blame me for what you see. Jon goes to the wall sometimes alone. He leaves Ghost to watch and walks with his gloved hand brushing ice and thinks of a boy in a yard saying words he thought old and then a man in a yard saying words he knew new. He thinks of Ed and Davos and Sansa and Arya and the girl queen on her dragon who learned to lay her palm on strange things and ask them to listen. He thinks of a world that was never his to fix. He does not regret freeing the men. He regrets only the time it took him to understand what binding means and what it does not. When the horn sounds thrice now, and he has heard it, in this late time absurdly beautifully men come, women come, the old gods stir as easily for them as for vowed men in black. A baker steps from her oven with flour on her cheek and lifts a spear that has had its head wrapped in oilcloth for years waiting. A smith leaves a bar white on his anvil and the hammer beside it, and he laughs and he runs without taking off his apron. A lord steward bangs on doors, and a plowman ties his fields to the sky with a glance at the cloud line and trusts it to hold. They come, they hold, then they go home. He knows then that magic likes duty. It likes words said as if they will cost. It likes men who die, but it also likes men who go home afterward and take up their lives as if those lives were worthy of being taken up. It is as fond of soup carried to a neighbor as it is of a sword well kept. He has seen this. He has bled for it. He wears the scar where the knives went in with less bitterness as years pass. He thinks of the moment he freed men from vows and seas, as if looking down through clear ice, that the knot he cut was tied again by many hands and in a better pattern. Once, in a soft snow that made no sound when it fell, he stood before the heart tree and felt, more than heard, a rustle in the leaves that were not moving. Thank you, the gods would said without words. You're welcome, he answered without speaking. Ghost shoved his muzzle into his palm, and Jon laughed aloud. Far below, the world ticked like something working properly. The wall did not purr. It never would. But it held its old breath in a new way, and that was enough, and that was everything.